Hi, everybody. It's me, Eric Johnson, Skyline Properties Designated Broker. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about getting paid as a buyer broker. So we're going to be digging in on a couple of forms. So bear with me. I'm going to pop them up on screen and we will cover the primary details that you need to do to guarantee that you get paid. Let's start with the law. So this is RCW 18.86.080. Long and short of this particular law is that if you do not have a representation agreement signed by your client prior to offering the services, then you're basically in violation of the law. Therefore, you would not be entitled to be compensated for your work. So in this case, we're talking about buyers. So you need a buyer broker representation agreement. That's the Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement. That's the BBSA Form 41. It says that you represent the buyer. So the next thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about using that form. So I've opened up Form 41, the Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement. Always be sure to check the revision date. This one was revised on 7 of 25. It could be revised again sometime in 2026, so be sure you check that. Most of this is pretty basic, who you're representing, who the firm is, who the buyer is, and what areas. I recommend you leave it unlimited. There are rare cases where you might go so limited that you put in a specific address here. I recommend you talk to your manager about anything other than just unlimited. But I would recommend you fill in unlimited rather than leaving it blank. The term of it defaults at 60 days. Again, I recommend you fill in the number of days that you plan to represent this buyer. Longer the better. So 60 days is frequently enough to find them a home and get them into the home. The term doesn't matter once you've got them under contract. Then it goes for as long as they're under contract in a purchase and sale agreement. Moving into agency, I recommend you do exclusive. The only reason I would ever recommend non-exclusive is if you are working with one of those investors who is working with every real estate broker under the sun, and they just want somebody to find them property, and they're going to work with whoever finds them the property. Then it's non-exclusive. The other reason to do non-exclusive, maybe if you were working with somebody, maybe you just met them at an open house, or you just met them somehow. They don't know you yet, but technically you need to have this contract signed by them in order to write up an offer on a home. So you should be doing it before you even show them homes. So I recommend worst case scenario is check non-exclusive then with the idea that you'll change it to exclusive at a later date as they get to know you. So this is really just a non-familiarity thing here. It would be the second reason, or the buyer is very upfront about the fact that they are working with multiple brokers. Limited dual agency, we do not allow at Skyline, so please do not do anything here. If anything, you could put in NA in here, or you could cross it off. That's all good. We do not want buyer's initials here because you will not be doing dual agency. Okay, it's compensation. This is the part where a lot of brokers they do it in a way that they think is crafty and clever. It's avoiding the hard conversation with the buyer. So we're going to kind of read this. The buyer acknowledges that there are no standard compensation rates, and the compensation in this agreement is fully negotiable and not set by law. Firm may not receive any compensation for brokerage services provided to the buyer from any source greater than the amount set forth in Section 5 or any subsequent amendment thereto. That would be a Form 41A, by the way. That's just an amendment to the Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement. So if we look at that line again, it says that the firm, that means you, are not allowed to receive any compensation if you don't have this form, and then you're not allowed to receive any more compensation than what is put on this form. Okay, so here, A is going to be your primary thing here, and that is going to be a percentage. You're going to put something in there. I'm not going to tell you how much to put there. It's going to be between you and your buyer. It needs to be negotiated. The typical listing out there, about 72% of all listings are offering 2.5% of the purchase price. That's kind of the trend right now. That's what we're seeing. There is no fixed rate. There is no guaranteed rate. Okay, so just make sure you never ever say that to your client. The other thing is you can put in a flat rate. If you're just going to charge $1,000 to your client, you could put $1,000 here. Under other, you will not put something like seller to pay, okay, because that does not meet the law. Okay, you have to be offered compensation by your client in order to receive that compensation, and you can't make it subject to the seller paying it. Okay, so we want you to put an amount in here, either a percent or a dollar sign. Under other, you could put a combination percent and dollars. Maybe you're going to get 1% plus $1,000. Then that's what you would write here. But don't do anything that implies that you're forcing the buyer to get it from the seller. This is an agreement between you and your buyer that your buyer agrees to compensate you for your time. And that would be typically through either a percentage or a flat fee. Again, Part B here, 5B, cannot do that. Don't put anything in there because we don't do limited dual agency. And then C, if the seller, say you're showing up for sale by owner home or something like that, then you can put that maybe you'd get a little extra because you're going to be writing it up and working with both sides. You're not going to represent the seller. Okay. And by the way, if you're ever dealing with this, please, before you go forward on writing up an offer, talk to your manager about the things that you need to do to have an unrepresented party in your transaction. But you could put a different percentage or a flat dollar amount, whatever you wish to here. Okay, then this goes on to say the seller's compensation. So a seller may, but is not required to offer compensation to the firm for representing the buyer in the purchase of a seller's real property. The seller's offer, if any, shall be stated in the purchase and sale agreement. The buyer may request that the seller pay the compensation to the firm. Okay, so we go back here. This is the compensation. Okay, so they may pay the compensation to the firm as part of the buyer's offer, and the buyer shall pay any amount of the compensation not paid by the seller. So if your buyer offers you 3%, the seller's offering 2.5%, and it ends up being 2.5% is what is agreed upon by all parties, and your buyer technically, according to this language, will pay the difference. It also says here, if the seller's offer is greater than the compensation as part of the buyer's offer, the buyer may request that the amount of the seller's offer that is greater than the compensation be credited to the buyer. So if the seller is offering 3%, but your buyer's only offered you 2%, in the PSA, you can put 2% as what your buyer is requesting from the seller, and then your buyer can check the box that says that they get a buyer credit, and then you use a Form 41C stating how that credit is going to look. Then they get that way they get the balance. Then we get into the compensation terms. This is pretty straightforward. It's basically a rehashing of what we talked about up above. If your client is a referral and you have to pay a referral to another firm, you have to disclose that under Washington law. So please be sure and fill in the referring firm and who it was here. That way it's very transparent that to your buyer that you're giving a portion of your compensation back to another brokerage. And then it just goes through some things here. We're not going to dig in too hard on the rest of it. You can read that and understand it. I'm going to flip over to Form 41. This is, by the way, if you're not using the manuals on the MLS, it's a great opportunity to learn a little more depth about what it is that you're working with here. Okay, so we get into the compensation, and again, it kind of rehashes what we talked about, but this is where you can read about it and get to understand it. Now I'm going to pop over to Form 21. Part U right here of Form 21 mirrors a lot of what you're seeing in your Form 41. It talks about the need for the buyer to sign a Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement, and it also talks about how much the buyer can request. And it also makes it very clear that you have to fill in on Form 21, it's 17, on Form 28 and a couple of the other PSAs, it's not line 17, it's like line 19. But 19A or 17A and then 17B must be filled in. So let's roll over to Form 20 or go up higher in Form 21 real quick. And let's look at this line 17A and B. Here it is. So you can choose, is it going to be, it's going to be a percentage. There's a semicolon here, which means it's the same sentence. So that percentage lines up with both of these spaces. So if the seller is offering 2.5, then you'd write that in. The seller has the choice of writing in a dollar amount, a percentage amount. They can offer 0 or none, and they can also put in request in offer. Request in offer means that they're open to paying a commission, but they want to hear what's being asked for. B is where you're going to put in the amount that your buyer has offered you on Form 41, no more than what they offered here. So here's the rule. Your buyer and you are in a contract. That's your BBSA, the Form 41. It's a contract between you and your buyer that your buyer is going to pay you for your services. Now on here, what you're basically doing is asking for a credit. Your buyer is asking for a credit from the seller that will line up with what they have to pay you so that they don't have to pay you. It all happens seamlessly at the escrow end of things before the end of the transaction, and the paycheck gets sent off to Skyline on your behalf, and we get you paid. Okay, so that's the basics of how that all works. That's the movement. Okay, so again, you have a contract with your buyer that your buyer's going to pay you. Your buyer has a contract with the seller that the seller is going to credit them an amount that is, hopefully the amount that they are asking from you. So, say the seller's offering 2.5%. Say they're offering 1%. Doesn't matter. You can still write in 2.5% here if your buyer has agreed to 2.5% on your BBSA. If your buyer has only agreed to 1%, you can only put 1% here. Say the seller has offered 2.5%, but your buyer has only offered you 1%, then your buyer would be entitled to the difference. And that's where you would check this box, use Form 41C, and state that your buyer gets the balance. Okay. So that's the basics of getting paid. We want to make sure all of you know about that. We want to make sure that you are, number one, you have to have a Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement. Okay. We cannot pay you if you do not have that because you are not entitled to be paid. Number two, you must fill in the buyer brokerage compensation portion. Again, it's 17 on this form. It could be 19 on a couple of the other forms. Part B, you must fill it in. If you leave it blank, you're saying, hey, seller, you don't have to pay the buyer any credit. Then your buyer would need to pay you directly, and you can't ask for the seller to pay you. So if that's not your intention that your buyer is paying you, then you want to fill in Part B. Okay, hopefully that all makes sense. If you have any questions on this, please contact your manager or me, your designated broker. We're happy to answer your questions. Have a great day.